A good day for them, a good day for journalism, a great day for press freedom, and a very bad day for Ginger, whining, treacherous little weasel. More on that in a moment.
But we can all sit here and laugh and poke at him and say, you have turned yourself, mate, into a humiliation. Because the High Court judgment found that Harry gave limited evidence on the issues at the heart of the case and strayed beyond factual evidence while in the witness box. In other words, he lied.
This isn't just a defeat in a civil case. This is Harry being exposed as not telling the truth under oath in the King's Court. This is serious stuff.
My view, and I've said this to you a lot before, is I just think if I'm King Charles, enough of this bullshit. Just strip them of the titles, Meghan and Harry, let them do their thing, stop the drama, the circus that applies to them everywhere they go, and just keep them away from us.
Absolutely. I mean, Meghan is a source of evil. I've said it many years ago, and it didn't make me popular with some people, but she's bad.
I never witnessed anything in terms of what we were accused of doing, and the accusations were despicable. So I feel emotional. I feel vindicated, Piers, is how I feel.
Well, you've been completely vindicated, as has the Mail, completely.
Not a good day for Prince Harry, not a good week for Prince Harry, and I just have no more sympathy for this man. All he does is whine and complain and expect everything. Enough.
Prince Harry testified under oath that he had no close friends in the press. Then, a collection of old Facebook messages surfaced that appeared to tell a very different story and sent shockwaves through what was being reported as a $67 million legal battle. Piers Morgan and Tom Bauer finally addressed the outcome publicly, and neither held back. Their remarks weren't measured or diplomatic. They reflected views that had apparently been building for years and were waiting for exactly this moment to be released. Prince Harry arrived in Britain this week reportedly prepared for either possible outcome. One speech drafted for a victory, another ready for defeat. In the end, he never had cause to reach for the version he had hoped to use. While attending a public Invictus Games event at Chatham House, surrounded by veterans with cameras rolling, someone quietly approached and informed him that the High Court had delivered its decision. The setting, veterans, cameras, an audience many believed he had hoped would witness a triumphant moment.
It's tarnished by losing a case which has cost them at least £50 million in costs. For Harry now, it's downhill faster than he can imagine.
Turned out to be the backdrop for something that landed very differently. The ruling was comprehensive and unambiguous. Out of 97 separate claims, not one succeeded. Take a full moment with that figure. Not a partial win, not a handful of claims upheld alongside a larger number dismissed, not even a single allegation accepted by the court. All 97 claims, covering a range of allegations against the Daily Mail and the Mail on Sunday, were dismissed in their entirety. For a case that Harry had publicly connected to his mother's memory, framing it as part of a broader mission to hold the press accountable, the totality of the defeat was stark and impossible to soften through any subsequent statement.
Experts estimate the case could cost as much as $60 million once legal fees and trial expenses are fully calculated. Under UK rules, Harry could also be ordered to pay a significant portion of the Associated Newspaper's costs, potentially adding millions more. I would argue 50 million more plus 60. It could be 100 million.
Reports from London suggested Harry may not have had clear advance warning of precisely how the decision would land. Some reports even claimed members of his legal team could have known about the outcome days before he arrived in the UK, which some observers believe might explain why he appeared visibly tense and under considerable pressure throughout the visit. He looked like someone carrying the weight of an anticipated verdict. And then the ruling finally arrived, in public, in front of the audience he had gathered around the Invictus cause, delivering a result that nobody in his camp had prepared a celebration speech for.
2 p.m. today, when we found out the results, he was doing a speech at Chatham House and his voice was shaking, he was all alone, he was clearly broken by the whole thing.
Yeah.
His wife wasn't by his side.
Piers Morgan didn't delay in responding. Shortly after the ruling was announced, he opened his broadcast and made his position clear without any softening of language. Referring to the outcome, he described it as a good day for those who had been vindicated, a good day for journalism, and a great day for press freedom, before adding his characterization of the people he believed had brought and supported the case using language that was deliberately provocative and widely quoted. Those were his exact words delivered on camera during a live broadcast, and they generated immediate and substantial reaction.
The point I would make is on hypocrisy, that Harry has made a fortune, gazillions of pounds, trashing his family and revealing the most extraordinarily intimate secrets.
Invading everyone else's privacy.
So this is the great royal privacy invader trying to put up this fake sword of the Shining Knight, you know, taking on the journalist for doing exactly what he does.
To put the scale of this case into genuine perspective, this wasn't a brief legal formality or a contained courtroom hearing. It involved an 11-week trial stretching across 45 separate court days. The legal costs on both sides grew to such a scale that the judge stepped in during the proceedings themselves and described the expenses as excessive, ordering a reduction before they climbed even further. When the final ruling was delivered, it ran to more than 400 pages. That document alone illustrates the complexity and depth of what had been argued, cross-examined, assessed, and ultimately decided over months of proceedings.
Let me just guide you back across the pond to what is happening here, because it involves an old friend of yours and mine, Prince Harry, the rogue son, who is crash landing into the UK today. And there's this gigantic furore, as always, has erupted around the little entitled brat.
Compare this case to Harry's earlier legal victory against the Mirror Group several years ago, when he was awarded approximately $188,000 in damages. The current case was reportedly more than 300 times larger in scale, and many observers had identified it as the legal battle Harry cared about most personally and emotionally. He had publicly connected it to Princess Diana's memory, describing his campaign against certain parts of the press as a continuation of something she had experienced and something she would have wanted challenged. That framing made the outcome carry weight that went well beyond the financial figures involved. At the center of the case was one key claim that formed the essential foundation of Harry's legal position. Under oath, he testified that his inner circle was tightly controlled and carefully guarded. No close friendships with journalists, no one within his social circle who was in a position to leak private information. His precise words were, "My social circles were not leaky." He followed that with, "I want to make that absolutely clear."
Today, in what was a momentous victory for the Mail, the High Court dismissed every single one of the 97 claims.
Now he really goes in to lean against Harry. Here it is.
If the court had accepted that account, it would have significantly narrowed the possible explanations for how private stories about him had reached newspapers over the years. One major allegation the case rested on was that the information had been obtained through unlawful means: phone hacking, improper interception, or other forms of illegal information gathering. That allegation was positioned as the logical conclusion if the alternative explanations were ruled out. Then, during the proceedings, the Mail's legal team introduced a collection of years-old Facebook messages exchanged between Harry and Charlotte Griffiths, a royal writer for the Mail, on Sunday. The messages were described in court as casual, familiar, and friendly in tone. One opened with Harry writing, "Hi, it's H," followed by a note clarifying in case she was confused by the photograph. She replied addressing him as Mr. Mischief. That exchange became one of the most discussed moments in the entire trial, and it was only the beginning of what the messages contained.
I wish the Mirror had fought this with the ferocity that the Mail did. The Mail just went, "We're not having this." And so I think this has been a vengeful campaign by Harry against all of Fleet Street, wanting to settle scores with all of them. Obviously, News UK, they settled with him. But I just think at the heart of this, you've got the most breathtaking hypocrite. Right.
The conversation continued back and forth on first-name terms across multiple exchanges. At one point, a message mentioned missing their movie Snuggles. That phrase traveled rapidly out of the courtroom and into headlines and social media commentary, becoming the single most quoted line from the case for a significant portion of the public following the proceedings. According to the arguments presented, Charlotte Griffiths had kept these messages entirely private for more than a decade. They hadn't been published. They hadn't formed the basis of any news story. They only became public when introduced during the legal proceedings after challenges to her credibility arose in court, making the revelation as dramatic as it was damaging to a central pillar of Harry's testimony. A direct factual contradiction in court testimony carries significant legal weight. When one element of a witness's account is successfully challenged, it invites closer and more skeptical scrutiny of the broader picture that witness has presented.
So, he's saying we presented the court evidence we believed to be compelling at the time and remains so now. We would like to thank our team for all the hard work and their pursuit to justice, blah, 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 blah. So that's how he's sort of trying to justify this by, surprise, surprise, whining.
During Harry's own testimony, the judge reportedly intervened on multiple occasions to redirect him toward answering the specific questions being put to him, rather than engaging in more expansive exchanges with counsel. Reports from inside the courtroom described moments that became more argumentative than straightforward testimony typically should be, a dynamic that didn't go unobserved by the judge ultimately responsible for assessing Harry's credibility as a witness. Meanwhile, another figure at the center of the proceedings was managing an entirely different kind of pressure. Royal journalist Katie Nicholl had spent approximately 20 years covering the royal family through traditional Fleet Street reporting.
The gigantic ego has landed. Prince Harry's officially back in the UK for a much-vaunted visit, which has now inevitably become another soap opera. And as it happens, he couldn't have timed it better if he was acting out a script written by his worst enemies.
17 of her articles were examined during the legal proceedings. Her sources, her methods, and her credibility as a journalist were challenged in open court, all while she was recovering from cancer surgery. At one stage, she described herself as barely able to walk up a flight of stairs, and yet she was simultaneously searching through old notebooks from years of reporting to defend work she had done across her career. The weight of that situation, professional scrutiny compounding physical recovery, is difficult to overstate. When the ruling arrived, the judge dismissed all claims relating to her reporting. He went further, describing her as a credible and impressive witness and accepting her evidence as honest and reliable.
Duke and other claimants were open to criticism for the way they pursued extremely serious allegations that senior associated staff lied to the Leveson inquiry into press standards. Evidence gathered by the legal research team behind the claims was unconvincing and inconsistent, perhaps because so many of them were criminals.
For journalists, a finding of that nature from a senior judge carries real professional significance and provides a form of vindication that goes beyond the immediate legal outcome. Speaking publicly afterward, visibly moved, Nicholl reflected on what 20 years of royal journalism had actually involved. Not glamour or proximity to power, but patient and persistent relationship building. Years spent earning trust from sources who had every reason not to speak to reporters.
Diana used to call me regularly. I used to go around for lunch at Kensington Palace. She'd call me. I'd tape the calls and she knew I was taping her. I'd send her the copy of the story I was going to run. She would send it back with little amendments. I've got all this, right? So this idea that Prince Harry seems to want the public to buy into, that every story about him and his family has been gained illegally by terrible journalists, it's just not true.
She described years of attendance at social events, quiet conversations, and consistent old-fashioned reporting that built genuine confidence over time. She specifically mentioned an elderly woman who had been close to the late Queen and who had eventually agreed to speak only because of trust built through years of professional consistency. She also noted, pointedly, that those social events had sometimes included gatherings where Prince Harry himself was present.
Harry was ensnared at Elton John's house in the south of France years ago to trust this group of lawyers and activists. And they were, in the end, the gravy train has come to an end. And Harry was used by them.
"I did journalism the hard way," she said. "I never witnessed anything in terms of what we were accused of doing." Those words resonated strongly in the post-verdict conversation. Maintaining genuine balance, it's important to acknowledge what was also presented during proceedings that reflected differently. The court heard allegations that a private investigator working on behalf of the Mail had obtained the airline seat number of Harry's former girlfriend Chelsea Davy and had explored placing someone in the adjacent seat on an international flight. Those allegations, if proven, would represent a serious and deeply troubling invasion of privacy.
He did say there were third-party intermediaries, hired scoopers, if you call them that, snoops, whatever. These third-party hired snoops did do some things wrong. It's that he's acknowledging that. They would sometimes do things right, like looking up an address in a public phone book, but also they would do some other private stuff, like tricking a bank into handing over private details by pretending to be them. Yes, that's illegal, but here's the problem.
Harry's legal team argued the described conduct came uncomfortably close to stalking. The court also heard from Elton John and his husband David Furnish, who testified that they believed their newborn son's birth certificate and medical records had been improperly accessed. Allegations carrying serious implications about the protection of highly sensitive personal information. There was additionally testimony about how Harry had learned he was to be godfather to a former nanny's child.
Don't forget, we were being quizzed, forensically about stories that were written some 20, 23 years ago. I can barely remember what I said 24 hours ago. We all have busy lives. No one's saying we can recollect absolutely everything that was said and done. I said this when I was giving evidence. I would have remembered intercepting someone's voicemail.
Information, he argued, could not have reached a newspaper through any legitimate channel because it simply wasn't public knowledge at the time. These were among the most serious privacy concerns raised throughout the case, and they were legitimate in their gravity regardless of the ultimate outcome of the judgment. The fundamental issue, according to the court's ruling, was that alleging a privacy violation and proving one to the required legal standard are not the same thing. Because this was a civil case rather than a criminal prosecution, the applicable standard wasn't beyond reasonable doubt.
Especially, for example, that journalist Charlotte Griffiths, who he said...
CG string.
who he said was fabricating her evidence, and she produced the evidence to show that he was lying.
He was offering cuddles.
And and that's the problem with him.
The court applied the balance of probabilities, what was more likely than not to have occurred. Even under that more accessible threshold, the judge repeatedly looked for specific evidence demonstrating that a particular piece of information could only have been obtained through unlawful means. Again and again throughout the case, the Mail's witnesses offered alternative and legitimate explanations for how various stories were sourced. In a significant number of instances, the judge found those explanations more persuasive than the allegations being advanced. The ruling also noted that many claims dated back 20 or 30 years, meaning substantial portions of the case rested on inference and probability rather than direct contemporary documentary evidence.
Self-slain, he caused his own, it's a reputational suicide, let's put it no milder than that.
Right.
And he has now got to find a way somehow to save himself.
And as the judgment made clear, inference, however strongly felt and however logically constructed, is not by itself sufficient to establish a civil claim of this scale and nature. The conversation between Piers Morgan and Tom Bower that followed the verdict attracted significant attention in its own right. Bower, despite his established public profile as a critic of Harry, made a pointed observation about judicial courage, saying the judge had been remarkably brave in delivering a ruling that, while stopping short of formally calling Harry a liar, clearly communicated that his testimony had not been accepted as credible.
The judge has been remarkably brave, because to punch Harry on the nose so violently, and although he hasn't called him a liar, implies that he didn't believe a word of his evidence, was brave in the normal rate of things. But you've got to remember how it all started. It all starts with the hacked-off people and Sherborne, the lawyer, coming to Harry with a statement by a so-called private detective that he had burgled his way into all the claimants' homes, laid wire traps, and all the rest of it.
Morgan then drew on his own documented history with Princess Diana, explaining that she would regularly call him, that their conversations were recorded with her knowledge, that she received copies before publication and returned them with her own amendments. His argument was that the picture of wholesale unlawful information gathering as the only explanation for how royal stories reached newspapers doesn't match the more complex reality of how some journalist-royal relationships had actually functioned. Information, he maintained, sometimes flows through conversations and voluntary disclosures, not exclusively through unlawful methods. The panel also addressed Harry's ongoing dispute over state-funded security when visiting Britain.
Damn! 50 million pounds wasted. Well, how much is he on the hook for? Well, they're claiming even more than that. It could be up to 60 million.
Morgan and commentator Kinsey Schofield raised the argument that seeking government-funded armed protection for private visits could blur the line between personal travel and official royal engagement. Family lawyer Paula Rowe offered a clear counterpoint, highlighting that Prince Andrew had received publicly funded security for an extended period under very different circumstances, raising the question of whether consistent standards were being applied across different members of the family. That exchange captured a tension that has run through the security debate from its beginning. The Oprah interview returned to the discussion, as it almost always does when Harry and Meghan generate sustained media coverage. Morgan raised the observation that years of publicly challenging the institution appeared to be giving way to efforts to rebuild connections with it, and that the timing of this visit sat interestingly alongside that shift. Whether that characterization is fair or reductive depends significantly on which version of events you find more credible.
This case came to light literally weeks after my surgery, when I couldn't even walk to the top of the stairs, and yet I was having to get old notebooks out. And thank goodness I kept all my notebooks and had so many records, because they showed that I was acting legitimately and carrying out proper journalistic practices. But no, it's been horrendous, and it's had an impact on my life. But I gave evidence because I wasn't going to have these accusations levelled at me anymore. I was fed up with it. My name was first dragged through the mud at Leveson by Hugh Grant. I wasn't going to have it again.
Tom Bower's view on the marriage generated its own considerable discussion. Asked directly whether he believed the relationship would continue, Bower said he believed it would, but for reasons he characterized as pragmatic rather than purely personal. In his reading, Harry and Meghan now depend on each other in ways that go beyond emotional partnership, as they face what he described as serious shared challenges regarding their public profiles and commercial ventures. His overall assessment was that the financial performance of projects connected to their brand has fallen short of what was needed to establish genuine long-term independence, leaving them more reliant than ever on a shared public identity that neither can sustain without the other. Harry was far from the only claimant in the case, a detail that shaped both the proceedings and the post-verdict conversation significantly. Elton John, Elizabeth Hurley, Sadie Frost, David Furnish, former MP Simon Hughes, and Baroness Doreen Lawrence were all involved. Simon Hughes described the outcome publicly as very disappointing.
Harry wanted to prove he was right. Instead, he walks away with a major legal defeat, an enormous bill, and critics convinced his war against the press has finally come at a devastating cost. Whew! Man. Not a good day for Prince Harry, not a good week for Prince Harry, and I just have no more sympathy for this man. All he does is whine and complain and whine and complain and expect everything. Enough. We just go away. Just go away, dude. Enough is enough. I wouldn't be surprised if he does get the next book ready to go. What do you think about all this?
Bower made a notably empathetic comment about Baroness Lawrence, whose son Stephen Lawrence was murdered in a racist attack decades ago, and whose campaign for justice had been publicly supported by the Daily Mail over many years. Bower said her position in a lawsuit against a newspaper that had championed her son's cause was, in his assessment, the most genuinely difficult and complicated situation arising from the case. Some commentators reinforced this point by arguing that people with very different levels of public resources and public profiles don't necessarily experience the same legal defeat in the same way, and that the practical and emotional consequences for different claimants warranted individual consideration.
I did things the old-fashioned way, went and knocked on doors, curated contacts, got people on side. I remember being told when I was under questioning, but, the Queen's late cousin, Lady Elizabeth Anson, at the time was a woman in her 70s. Why on earth would she speak to you? This sort of sense of disbelief that these sorts of people would speak to us. Well, they did.
Mail editor-in-chief Paul Dacre added his own pointed response to the verdict's public conversation. He challenged the coherence of Harry's privacy arguments by referencing the volume of personal family detail Harry had shared through his memoir and interviews over recent years, arguing that the combination of those public disclosures and the privacy complaints was fundamentally contradictory. His formulation traveled quickly. There isn't a laundry in the cosmos big enough to wash all the dirty linen Harry has aired about his own family. And on the privacy complaints specifically, for him to complain about his privacy being invaded takes not just the biscuit, but the whole tin. The whole tin.
I never did any of those things. I never witnessed any of those things at the Mail. And so it is a great day because they are great journalists. And it's been very upsetting for me to see so many of my esteemed colleagues, amazing people that have devoted their lives to their careers at great personal costs, have their reputations tarnished the way that they have been. So
Dacre also made the claim that Princess Diana had trusted and engaged with the Mail during some of the most difficult periods of her life, a direct challenge to the framing Harry had used to present his legal campaign as continuation of something she would have supported. Reports also surfaced indicating that settlement discussions had been explored by some claimants in the months before the trial, reportedly including discussions close to Christmas, but the Mail declined and elected to defend the case fully in open court instead. Supporters of the defense argued that decision reflected genuine confidence in the evidence and a willingness to have every allegation tested publicly under proper scrutiny. The court ultimately ruled comprehensively in its favor, making the choice to litigate rather than settle look, in retrospect, like a strategically sound decision that produced the result the defense had believed the evidence supported.
Did journalism the hard way, right? I went out every night. I partied with Prince Harry. That story came out in the court when, he couldn't remember, but he invited me into the party, into his inner circle. I did things the old-fashioned way, went and knocked on doors, curated contacts, got people on side. I remember being told when I was under questioning, but, the Queen's late cousin, Lady Elizabeth Anson, at the time was a woman in her 70s. Why on earth would she speak to you? This sort of sense of disbelief that these sorts of people would speak to us.
The financial consequences remain unresolved. Under the standard legal principle that the losing party may be required to contribute to the winner's costs, the question of who pays what has attracted enormous attention. Reports suggested combined legal costs in the region of £50 million.
He wants to be taken as a serious person, and this loss jeopardizes his credibility, it jeopardizes his authority, and I think it jeopardizes his future when it comes to making money. Because, I do think he wanted to be a speaker and go on the circuit. And who's going to sit back and take him seriously when it appears that he is a dishonest person?
A further hearing scheduled for the end of July is expected to address cost allocation between parties. Insurance arrangements may cover portions of the liability, but the specific terms and applicable coverage aren't publicly confirmed. And depending on the court's eventual order and any policy conditions, significant financial exposure could remain for some of those involved. All of these developments converge during what many commentators described straightforwardly as one of the most difficult weeks Prince Harry has faced in public life.
What the judge said was, in terms of the evidence, there simply wasn't, I think he used the word anchorage. There wasn't the evidence that the judge could anchor to the allegations.
That's not true.
But he was lying.
Suspicion.
You can say that.
Suspicion wasn't enough.
You can say that.
I did.
All right?
Suspicion
And Katie's right. Suspicion wasn't enough.
Yeah.
Okay, so it wasn't about, as you said, Piers, at the beginning, that this person was lying or that person was lying. What happens was there simply wasn't the evidence there to support
Harry
the
says when the court says there is not sufficient evidence of wrongdoing, despite the document showing otherwise, then one does wonder how justice was ever going to be done.
Reports claimed Buckingham Palace had initially offered him accommodation during the visit, but that the offer was later withdrawn after a decision wasn't made within the available window. Meghan and the children remained in the United States throughout. Reports simultaneously indicated that the Invictus Games Foundation, the cause most publicly associated with his humanitarian work, was facing financial pressures and fundraising challenges that added another layer to an already difficult period. Harry reportedly arrived with 2 speeches prepared. He delivered neither version he had hoped to use. The court dismissed every one of his claims, the judgment dominated international headlines, the legal cost question remains open, and the next significant development comes at the end of July, when the court addresses how the enormous financial burden of this 11-week trial will be distributed. While the central ruling has been delivered, the story has meaningful chapters still to unfold, and the consequences for Harry's public standing, the other claimants involved, and the broader press freedom debate that the case has reignited will continue developing in the months ahead. Drop your thoughts below and subscribe so you don't miss the next development when it arrives.